Farrah, it was just old jewelry. Nobody was going to wear it anyway. That's what my sister Tamsin said to me 3 days after we buried our grandmother Harriet, standing in the middle of her bedroom like she hadn't just gutted the most sacred thing our family had. I stared at her. I couldn't even form words. But later that same afternoon, while I was alone cleaning out my grandmother's back closet, I found something behind the winter coats, a small fireproof safe, and the combination was my birthday. If this story is already hitting close to home, stay with me, because what was inside that safe changed absolutely everything. My name is Farrah. I'm 43 years old, and I've lived in Boise, Idaho my entire life. I grew up in a house where love was distributed unevenly, like someone was always running out of it by the time they got to me. My younger sister Tamsin was the one who got the extra helpings, the praise, the patience, the benefit of every single doubt. And I was the one who learned early that in our family, being quiet and capable just meant you got handed more weight to carry without anyone ever asking if you were okay. But there was one person who always asked. One person who looked at me like I was worth something just as I was. My grandmother Harriet. She was 79 years old when she died. A small woman with sharp eyes and hands that smelled like lavender lotion and cedar. She had lived in the same house on Ridgecrest Avenue in Boise for over 40 years. A modest two-story with a rose garden out front that she tended every single spring without fail. She wasn't a woman who talked much about feelings. She showed them instead. In the way she always had my favorite tea ready when I visited. In the way she remembered every small thing I ever told her. In the way she looked at me during family dinners when Roxanne, my mother, would talk over me or wave off something I said. Harriet would catch my eye from across the table and give me the smallest, steadiest nod. Like she was saying, I hear you. I always hear you. She had a stroke on a Tuesday in late October. By Thursday morning, she was gone. It happened so fast that I don't think any of us fully processed it before the funeral arrangements were already underway. Tamsin swooped in immediately, organizing, directing, making decisions, and our mother Roxanne stood beside her nodding at everything she said, like Tamsin was the only adult in the room. I handled the actual paperwork, the death certificates, the calls to the bank and the utility companies, the things nobody notices until they don't get done. The funeral was on a Saturday, small and quiet, the way Harriet would have wanted. I held it together through the whole service. I held it together through the reception afterward, through the small talk and the casseroles and the neighbors saying she was such a lovely woman. I held it together until I was alone in my car in the parking lot of the funeral home. And then I just completely fell apart. I sat there for 20 minutes sobbing in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, because she was the last person in my family who had ever truly been in my corner. And now she was gone. 2 days later, I drove back to my grandmother's house to help sort through her belongings. Tamsin had said she'd be there too. When I arrived, Tamsin's car was already in the driveway. I let myself in with the spare key Harriet had given me years ago, a key Tamsin didn't even know I had. And I walked through the quiet house, breathing in that familiar mix of lavender and old wood and something that just smelled like her. I went upstairs first, to her bedroom, and the moment I stepped through that doorway and saw her dresser, something cold moved through my chest. The jewelry box was open. I crossed the room slowly, like part of me already knew. I looked inside. Every single compartment was empty. I stood there staring at that empty jewelry box for a long moment. My fingers touched the velvet lining inside, that worn burgundy velvet I had seen 100 times, always cushioning something precious. Now it was just bare fabric. I picked up the box and turned it over like maybe I was missing something, like maybe there was a hidden compartment or a logical explanation that would make this make sense. There was nothing. I heard Tamsin's footsteps on the stairs before I heard her voice. She appeared in the doorway holding a garbage bag in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, looking completely unbothered. She glanced at me, then at the jewelry box in my hands, and something flickered across her face. Not guilt, not even discomfort, just a quick calculation. "Oh," she said. "Yeah, I meant to mention that." I turned to face her slowly. "Mention what, Tamsin?" She set her coffee down on the nightstand, on my grandmother's nightstand, without a coaster, like it was already just furniture in an empty house. And she shifted her weight to one hip. "I sold the jewelry. A few weeks ago, actually, before she passed. Graham said I could." The floor felt unsteady under me. "She said you could." "She did. She told me to take whatever I wanted. I set the jewelry box down carefully because my hands had started shaking and I didn't want to drop it. Grandma Harriet told you to take her jewelry and sell it. She said, take whatever I wanted, Tamsin repeated. And there was an edge in her voice now, a warning edge, the one she always used when she wanted me to just drop something and move on. I needed the money. The kids have been asking about Disney World for 2 years, Farrah. 2 years. Do you know what it's like to keep telling your children no? I looked at her. I looked at her standing there in our dead grandmother's bedroom, holding a garbage bag, explaining to me that she had sold Harriet's pearl earrings and her sapphire ring and her gold locket with the tiny photograph inside, sold all of it, for a theme park vacation. And she was looking back at me like I was the unreasonable one for having a problem with it. Those pieces weren't just jewelry, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. The sapphire ring was her mother's. She told me when I was 12 that she was leaving it to me. She said it by name, Tamsin. She looked me in the eye and said, Farrah, this ring is yours one day. Tamsin's jaw tightened. People say things like that all the time. It doesn't mean anything legally. I'm not talking about legally right now. I'm talking about what was right. She picked up her coffee again. Well, it's done. There's nothing to go back and change, so I don't really see the point of this conversation. I was still standing there trying to find words when I heard the front door open downstairs, and then my mother Roxanne's voice calling up that she'd brought lunch. Tamsin turned and walked out of the bedroom like the conversation was fully closed. I stood alone in that room for another minute, my chest so tight I had to concentrate on breathing.
When I came downstairs, Roxanne had spread deli containers across the kitchen table and was already laughing at something Tamsin had said.
She looked up at me when I walked in and smiled the way she always smiled at me. Pleasant, surface level, the smile she used for people she was tolerating. You look pale, she said. Sit down and eat something. Did you know, I asked, about the jewelry? Roxanne's smile didn't drop. She just reached for a napkin and said, very calmly, Tamsin needed the money, Farrah. Your grandmother would have understood. And just like that, it was settled. In their minds, it was already settled. 2 women sitting at a dead woman's kitchen table, completely at peace with what had been taken. I sat down. I didn't eat. I just sat there quietly. And inside my chest, something that had been soft and grieving started to go very, very still. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, the same narrow room I'd grown up in, the one with the window that overlooked the rose garden. And I stared at the ceiling and let myself remember, not the funeral, not Tamsin's face in that doorway. I let myself remember Harriet. The first memory that came was from when I was 9 years old. I had come home from school with a project grade that my teacher had marked down unfairly, and I was trying to explain it to Roxanne at the kitchen counter. My mother listened for about 45 seconds before she said, Farrah, I really don't have the energy for this right now, and walked out of the room. I stood there alone holding my paper with this hollow feeling in my stomach that I didn't have a word for yet. That evening my grandmother called. She did that sometimes, just called to check in, and somehow she always seemed to call on the exact days I needed her to. I told her about the grade. I told her what Roxanne had said. There was a pause on the line, and then Harriet said, quietly and firmly, you come over Saturday and you tell me the whole story. Every detail. I want to hear all of it. And she meant it. That Saturday I sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours, and she listened to every single word I said without once glancing at her watch or looking toward the door. That was who she was. As I got older, our Saturday visits became something I protected fiercely, no matter what else was happening in my life. Work stress, a difficult marriage that eventually fell apart, the exhausting loneliness of being the family member nobody thought to call unless they needed something. Those Saturday mornings at Harriet's house were the one constant that felt safe. We would sit in her kitchen with the window above the sink, letting in that pale Idaho morning light. And she would make chamomile tea, and I would make us both toast, and we would just talk. Really talk about life, and regret, and what mattered, and what didn't. She started showing me the jewelry about 4 years before she died. Not showing off. Harriet was never that. She would take out a piece and hold it, and tell me the story behind it. The pearl earrings her late husband Wallace had given her on their 20th anniversary, the thin gold bracelet her own mother had worn every day of her adult life, the sapphire ring that had come from her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had all known some version of quiet, Unacknowledged strength. One Saturday, she held that sapphire ring up to the kitchen window light, and the stone caught it and threw a small blue shadow across the wall. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at me and said, "This one's yours, Farrah. When I'm gone, this comes to you. I've already written it down." I remembered laughing a little, telling her not to talk like that. She gave me a look, that sharp, steady look of hers, and said, "I'm not being morbid. I'm being practical. I want you to know it's yours, so nobody can tell you otherwise." I had held that memory gently for 4 years, like something I kept in a safe place inside myself. And Tamsin had walked into a pawn shop and traded it for fast passes and hotel points. The rage that moved through me lying in that bed was different from anything I'd felt before. It wasn't hot, it wasn't loud, it was cold, and it was slow, and it settled into my bones like winter. I thought about Harriet saying, "I've already written it down." I thought about that phrase in the dark. Written it down. She was meticulous. She kept records of everything. Birthday cards from 40 years ago. Receipts for appliances she'd owned since the 70s. She didn't say things she didn't mean, and she didn't make promises she hadn't prepared for. So where had she written it down? I sat up in the dark, and I decided that tomorrow I was going to look. I was back at my grandmother's house by 7:30 the next morning. Tamsin's car wasn't there. Roxanne's wasn't either. I had timed it that way deliberately, leaving my own place before 6, stopping for coffee I barely tasted, arriving in the pale quiet of early morning when the rose garden out front still had frost on it and the street was completely still. I let myself in with my key and stood in the entryway for a moment, just listening to the silence of the house. It had a different quality now, that silence. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of a place that had been disturbed and not yet settled again. I started in the obvious places. Her bedroom desk, a small roll top she had kept locked, but I found the key in the ceramic dish on her windowsill where she always kept it. Inside were utility bills, medical records, a folder of appliance warranties going back to 1987, and a small notebook filled with her handwriting. I went through every page carefully. Grocery lists, phone numbers of neighbors, a few Bible verses she had copied out in her careful, slanted script. Nothing about the jewelry, nothing about her wishes. I checked the drawer in her bedside table. Her Bible, a tube of hand cream, reading glasses, a notepad with nothing written on it. I checked the filing cabinet in the small room she used as a home office. Tax returns going back 20 years, insurance documents, a folder labeled Wallace that held her late husband's death certificate and their marriage license, which I held for a moment before carefully putting back. 2 hours in, I had gone through most of the main floor, and I was starting to feel the particular frustration of looking for something you're not even sure exists. I stood in the hallway with my hands on my hips, and I just thought. I closed my eyes, and I thought about Harriet, about the way she moved through this house, about the places she went that I never paid close attention to because they seemed unremarkable. And then I thought about the back closet. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a deep, narrow closet Harriet used for seasonal storage. Winter coats, spare blankets, a box of Christmas ornaments she had owned since before my mother was born. I had walked past it 100 times without ever really thinking about what was in there. I went upstairs and opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. Cedar blocks and old wool and something faintly floral that I couldn't identify. I started pulling things out carefully. The coats first, laying them across the hallway floor, then a stack of folded blankets, a box of ornaments I set aside gently, a pair of old snow boots, and then shoved all the way to the back left corner, almost completely invisible behind where the coats had been hanging. A small fireproof safe, gunmetal gray, about the size of a shoebox, sitting on the floor like it had been there for years, which it probably had. My heart was beating very fast. I knelt down in front of it. There was a combination dial on the front, old style, the kind you turn left and right. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. Harriet didn't do things randomly. Everything in her life had intention behind it. The combination to this safe would mean something. I tried her wedding anniversary first. Nothing. I tried the year she was born. Nothing. I sat there for a moment, and then something moved through me, quiet and certain, and I reached forward and dialed in my own birthday. Month, day, year. The numbers I had known my whole life. The lock released with a soft, clean click. I sat very still for a moment with my hand on the door, and I thought, she set this for me. She always meant for me to find this. and that thought cracked something open in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. My eyes filled before I even saw what was inside. I pulled the door open slowly, and I looked. The first thing I saw was an envelope, cream-colored, slightly thick, with my name written on the front in Harriet's handwriting. Just Farrah. No last name, no formal address. Just my name in that careful slanted script I had known my whole life, written like she was passing me a note across a kitchen table. I picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it. My hands were shaking, not from cold. The house was warm enough, just from the weight of what I was holding. A letter from a woman who was gone. Words she had written knowing she wouldn't be there when I read them. Underneath the envelope was a folded document, several pages, stapled together. I set the envelope carefully on my knee and picked up the document first. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Then the header registered. Last Will and Testament of Harriet Louise Greer. Dated 14 months ago. I turned to the second page and then the third, reading slowly, and by the fourth page my breath had gone completely shallow. This was not the will Tamsin and Roxanne had referenced in the days after Harriet's death. The will they had discussed, briefly, dismissively, as though it were a formality, had been an older document, one that divided Harriet's estate generally between her two granddaughters. This document was different. This one was specific, amended, witnessed, and notarized with a date that postdated the other version by nearly 2 years. I kept reading. There was a full page dedicated to the jewelry, each piece listed by name and description with a handwritten note beside each one indicating its intended recipient. The sapphire ring, my name. The pearl earrings, my name. The gold locket, my name. A few smaller pieces went to cousins I barely knew. Not a single piece was listed for Tamsin. I set the will down on the closet floor and pressed both hands flat against my thighs and just breathed for a minute. Then I picked up the other documents. There were 2 more folded papers beneath where the will had been. The first was a single typed sheet from a property management company based in Boise. A rental summary for a property on Clearwater Drive. A small 2-bedroom house that had been generating rental income for the past 11 years. I had never heard Harriet mention it. Not once. The summary listed the current tenant, the monthly rent, the maintenance history. At the top, handwritten in Harriet's pen, were 4 words. Paid off. Yours now, Farrah. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time. The second document was a letter from Harriet's attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, whose office was on 8th Street in downtown Boise. It was addressed to me by name. It explained that Mr. Foss held a copy of the amended will and had been instructed by Harriet to contact me directly upon confirmation of her passing. But that Harriet had also wanted me to find this safe first, to read her letter first, before lawyers and paperwork and family arguments made everything clinical and cold. I looked down at the cream envelope still sitting on my knee. I opened it carefully, trying not to tear the flap, and unfolded 2 pages of Harriet's handwriting. The letter began without preamble, the way she always talked. Farrah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found the safe, which means you were paying attention, which doesn't surprise me one bit, because you always were. I pressed my hand over my mouth. I need you to know some things. First, the jewelry. I never told Tamsin she could have it. I never said those words to her. What I said, the last time she visited, was that she could take the quilt from the guest room and the set of china in the dining hutch. That is all I said. I want you to know that because I know what she's capable of, and I want you to have the truth in your own hands before anything else happens. The room went very quiet around me. Second, the house on Clearwater Drive is yours, has been yours in my heart for a long time. Now it's yours on paper, too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I sat in that closet hallway for almost an hour. I read Harriet's letter 3 times, every word. I let it move through me slowly, the way you let something important settle, not rushing past the pain of it, not skipping to the part where you know what to do next. I just sat with her words in my hands, and I let myself feel the full weight of being known by someone who was no longer there to know me anymore. Then I folded the letter carefully, put everything back in the envelope, gathered every document from the safe, and I went downstairs to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea in Harriet's kitchen, using her kettle and her mugs and her tin of tea bags that still had maybe a dozen left. I sat at her table by the window with the pale morning light coming in, and I drank it slowly, and I thought with absolute clarity about what I was going to do. I was not going to call Tamsin. I was not going to call Roxanne. I was not going to have an emotional confrontation in this kitchen that would let either of them see me rattled, or give them time to strategize, or manufacture a counter-narrative before I had my footing completely under me. I had learned a long time ago that in this family, whoever lost their composure first lost everything. I was not going to lose anything else. I called Gerald Foss's office that same afternoon. His assistant answered, and when I gave my name, she said, almost immediately, "Oh yes, Ms. Farrah, Mr. Foss has been expecting your call." That small sentence hit me harder than I expected. Harriet had told him to expect me. She had planned for this. She had set everything in motion quietly and carefully, the way she did everything, and she had trusted that I would find it. I had an appointment with Gerald Foss 2 days later. I went alone. His office was small and warm and smelled like old paper and coffee. And he was a compact, gray-haired man in his late 60s who shook my hand and said, "Your grandmother was one of the most deliberately thoughtful people I have worked with in 40 years of practice." I believed him completely. He walked me through everything. The amended will was entirely valid, properly witnessed, notarized, filed with the county. It superseded the earlier version in full. The rental property on Clearwater Drive was already in the process of being transferred to my name per Harriet's prior instructions. He confirmed that the jewelry list in the will created a clear record of Harriet's intentions, and that while the pieces had already been sold, the documentation established that Tamsin had disposed of assets that were not legally hers to sell. I drove home from that meeting with all the paperwork on the passenger seat, and I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I felt something I hadn't felt in days, something steady and quiet and almost calm. Not happiness, not victory, just the particular feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time of standing on something that kept shifting. I gave it 4 more days before it unraveled. Roxanne called me on a Thursday evening. I knew from the first syllable that something had changed. Her voice had lost its pleasant surface-level warmth, the tone she used when she was managing me. This was a different voice. Clipped, tight, just barely controlled. "Gerald Foss sent a letter to the house," she said. "About the will." I didn't say anything. "Farrah, there is apparently some amended document that we were never told about. Tamsin is very upset." I kept my voice completely even. "Okay. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say, Mom?" A pause. Then her voice dropped lower, and something sharp came into it. "I want you to explain why you went behind this family's back and got a lawyer involved without telling anyone." I almost laughed. I almost actually laughed. "I didn't get a lawyer involved," I said quietly. "Grandma Harriet did. A long time ago. I just showed up." The silence on the line was long and very cold. "Tamsin is coming over Sunday," Roxanne said finally. "We need to sit down together and discuss this like adults." I agreed to Sunday. I said goodbye. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in the quiet of my own house. And then I started getting ready for Sunday. Sunday came gray and cold, the way Boise mornings do in late November, the kind of cold that sits in the air without wind, just pressing down on everything quietly. I drove to Roxanne's house with Gerald Foss's documents in a folder on the passenger seat, the same folder I had carried to his office, and I wore the same calm I had been practicing all week like a second skin. Tamsin was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at Roxanne's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug and her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying, which, under any other circumstances, might have moved me. She looked up when I walked in, and something crossed her face. Not guilt, still not guilt, but something defensive and raw, like an animal that knows it's cornered but hasn't decided yet whether to run or bite. Roxanne stood at the counter. She gestured toward the table without warmth. "Sit down." I sat. I placed my folder on the table, but I didn't open it yet. Tamsin started first, which I expected. "I want you to know," she said, and her voice had that particular shake in it that she had always used to signal that she was the wounded party in any situation, that Graham told me to take what I wanted. Those were her exact words. She looked right at me and said, "Take what you want." She said, "Take the quilt and the china," I said. Those were her exact words. She wrote it in a letter. Tamsin's jaw tightened. You can't prove what she meant. I opened the folder. I slid the copy of Harriet's letter across the table without saying anything and let Tamsin read it herself. I watched her eyes move across the page. I watched the moment she reached the line about the jewelry. I never told Tamsin she could have it. I never said those words to her, because her face went completely still in a way that was more telling than any reaction she could have performed. Roxanne crossed the kitchen and read over Tamsin's shoulder. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I had ever sat inside. "This doesn't change anything," Roxanne said finally. Her voice was careful now, measured. "What's done is done. The jewelry is gone." "I know," I said. "But the will isn't gone, and the property on Clearwater Drive isn't gone." I slid the amended will across the table next. "Harriet amended her will 14 months ago. Everything is properly filed. Gerald Foss has the original. What you're holding is a certified copy." Tamsin pushed back from the table and stood up. "This is unbelievable. You're really going to do this? You're going to use a piece of paper to blow up this entire family over some old jewelry and a rental house?" I looked up at her. "Tamsin, you sold our grandmother's jewelry while she was still alive. You took pieces she had promised me by name, and you traded them for a vacation. And then you stood in her bedroom 3 days after her funeral and told me it was just old jewelry." I paused. I didn't blow anything up. I just stopped pretending the explosion didn't happen. She left 20 minutes later without finishing her coffee. Roxanne walked her out, and I sat at that kitchen table alone, listening to the muffled sound of them talking on the front porch. Low, urgent voices I couldn't make out. When Roxanne came back inside, she stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. She didn't say anything. She just turned and went into the other room. I gathered my documents, I put on my coat, and I let myself out. 2 weeks later, Gerald Foss called to tell me the property transfer was complete. The small house on Clearwater Drive was officially mine. I drove past it that same evening. A modest 2-bedroom with a bare maple tree in the front yard and warm light showing through the curtains where the tenant lived. And I sat outside it for a few minutes just looking. Gerald had also quietly contacted 3 pawn shops in the Boise area with Harriet's jewelry list. One of them had the sapphire ring. It hadn't sold yet. I bought it back for $400, a fraction of what it was worth, but that wasn't the point. I held it in my palm in the parking lot of that pawn shop, and I thought about Harriet holding it up to her kitchen window and the blue shadow it threw across the wall. I wear it now, every single day. Some people ask me if I feel guilty for how everything unfolded with Tamsin and Roxanne. I think about that honestly when they ask. And the answer is no, not because I'm hard or cold or because I stopped loving them, but because what happened wasn't something I chose. It was something I finally stopped absorbing alone. Harriet had seen it clearly enough to plan around it. She had spent the last years of her life making sure that when the moment came, I would have something solid to stand on. She gave me that, even from the other side of everything. And I carry her with me now, not just in the ring, not just in the deed to a house on Clearwater Drive, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that someone who loved me clearly had always seen me clearly. That is worth more than anything Tamsin could have sold.